Good day. I'd like to thank you for this opportunity to talk about a timely topic, and this is regarding dietary patterns and the changing landscape from nutrients to dietary patterns, particularly their implications to child health. I'm Dr. Jossie Rogacion, a retired professor of pediatrics and a practicing pediatric gastroenterologist in the Philippines. Diet has undergone a lot of changes in the last several decades. From a purely nutritional function, it has now become a platform to promote and protect against chronic diseases. So today, I'm going to talk about diet and disease relationship, initially focusing on what is a healthy diet and why was there a shift from nutrient to dietary pattern approach, and focus on dietary patterns themselves, the methods to determine them, and the most important part is the relationship of dietary patterns to disease outcomes, not only in adults, but also in children. The World Health Organization defines a healthy diet as something or a diet that helps to protect against malnutrition in all its forms, whether undernutrition or overnutrition. And the most important change is now its protection against non-communicable diseases or NCDs, including diabetes, heart disease, stroke, and cancer. For adults, a healthy diet should include the following: fruits, vegetables, legumes, nuts, and whole grains, at least 5 portions of fruit and vegetables a day, less than 10% of total energy intake from free sugars, less than 30% of total energy from fats, preferably unsaturated fats, and that the saturated fats be reduced to less than 10%, with less than 1% of these as trans fats. And lastly, less than 5 grams of salt per day, which should be iodized. For infants and young children, optimal nutrition should be provided for the first 2 years of life to foster not only healthy growth and improve cognitive development, but more importantly now, to reduce the risk of becoming overweight or obese and developing NCDs later in life. The healthy diet in infants and young children is actually similar to adults, but emphasizes on the following. Infants should be exclusively breastfed during the first 6 months of life and should continue until 2 years of age, even beyond that. And that starting 6 months of age, adequate, safe, and nutrient-dense food should be started as complementary foods, with salt and sugars not being added to these complementary foods. This diet and disease relationship that we are now espousing has previously focused on individual nutrients, minerals, vitamins, carbohydrates, fats, and proteins, and their relationship to diseases. But right now, this single nutrient approach is being relegated to the background because of certain disadvantages. First, it is difficult to attribute certain health effects to just one single dietary component, because dietary components within food may interact with each other, and we call this food synergy. In relation to this, when manipulating the diet, there may be substitution effects, meaning to say, a high intake of one dietary component may be accompanied by changes in other aspects of the diet. And the reverse may also be true with whether it has high or low intake. Now, this slide shows you the determinants of health outcomes. Health outcomes in terms of diseases and good health. Now, this composite figure shows you that right now, the focus is on dietary patterns. We started with macronutrients, micronutrients, food groups, and now what is being advocated is to talk about dietary patterns as they relate to health outcomes and eventually will determine the overall dietary quality. Now, what is dietary pattern, or what are dietary patterns? So dietary patterns are quantities, proportions, variety, or combination of different foods, drinks, and nutrients in the diets And not only that, no, it's also related to the frequency with which they are habitually being consumed. In the early 2000s, this was the trend. The trend has reversed, no? When there was a shift from single nutrient or food to dietary pattern to explain the totality of the diet profile. So what then is a healthy dietary pattern? So a healthy dietary pattern is nutrient-dense foods and beverages across all food groups that are recommended in certain amounts and within certain calorie limits. The important thing about dietary pattern is that they should not only support present health, but also look into the future, meaning to say, look into the promotion and protection against serious health outcomes or chronic health diseases in later life. The other thing that is important to know is that healthy dietary patterns should be established early, even during early infancy or sometimes prenatally with good maternal nutrition. And at the same time, early establishment should be preceded to what we call maintenance of this, the healthy dietary pattern. So maintenance is the key to minimize diet-related chronic disease risk. Conversely, if one consumes an unhealthy dietary pattern throughout his lifespan, this practice can increase the risk of developing chronic diseases. And among the chronic diseases that I have looked into are the following: cardiovascular diseases, obesity and overweight, diabetes, and even some cancers. Now, it has often been mentioned that dietary pattern can be used to assess diet quality. So it's a good assessment tool, no, to determine diet quality. And the steps to this include the following. First, you need to determine the nutrient content of the different foods and beverages. And then next, to compare these characteristics to age and sex-specific recommendations for nutrient inadequacy and quantitative limits. Now, there are two common methods to derive dietary pattern. Either it is index-based or data-driven. So for index-based approach, this is what we call a priori approach, meaning to say they rely on scientific knowledge from previous investigations into health promoting and disease preventing diets. And after that, they measure compliance with the pre-existing diet quality index, current guidelines, or specific dietary pattern and assign scores that reflect the level of adherence. So in other words, there is an existing standard or guidelines, and any diet should conform to this, and what deviations will be what is measured in terms of certain dietary scores. Examples of this index-based approach are the following. You have the Healthy Eating Index, you have the Mediterranean Diet Score, or the dietary approaches to stop hypertension or DASH score. On the other hand, the data-driven approach is a posteriori. Remember, the other one is a priori, this one is a posteriori. So meaning to say, there are available data, and this data determine the patterns using statistical methods to generate them. So they provide information about existing dietary patterns within a specific population. They do not identify any ideal dietary pattern, but captures the primary sources of variation within the study population. So in short, you have an existing data from, let's say, food consumption, and then you model it and see what are the existing or the most important variations in the diet, that can explain for a specific dietary pattern. Examples of your data-driven approaches are the following: principal component analysis, cluster analysis, or factor analysis. So these are the steps for this approach. First, you systematically reduce the number of foods or food groups reported by people to reach an optimal combination of food groups that best explains or predicts the outcomes of interest, like for example, the occurrence of obesity or heart disease or even cancers. Then the inputs or predictors from that statistical analysis are aggregated into what we call linear combinations that explain the maximum amount of variance across all variables. So these principal components or factors are now referred to as your dietary patterns. So examples of this are, the terms can be generated as something like sweets pattern, healthy pattern, or a Western dietary pattern. So for both, I think your index-based approach is more for population-based, no? Whereas your data-driven approach is more for a specific population. And sometimes generalizability is a problem with your data-driven approach. Now, examples of your index-based approach is the Healthy Eating Index in 2015 as performed by the US Department of Agriculture. So this slide shows you that you have these different components from total fruits down the line to fatty acids, which should be given in adequate amounts. And then from refined grains in the lower part of the table to saturated fats, which should be taken in moderation. And then they assign maximum points for each component. So there will be intakes between the minimum and the maximum standards, and they are being scored proportionately, no? So the total healthy index score should be the sum of the adequacy components, meaning to say the food to eat more, foods to eat more of for good health, and components to be taken in moderation, which are the foods to limit for good health. So the sum of this adequacy and moderation food components is what makes up your total healthy eating index score. Now this HEI 2015 was used, no, to align with the most current dietary guidelines for Americans in 2020. And the data yielded the following. So this is how the US scored by their age group, no? So the HEI, the maximum total score is 100, and you have here the different age groups, no? From age 2 to 4 up to 60 and above. And you can see that the healthy eating index score of Americans are actually just over 50%, no, of the maximum total score, particularly in ages 14 to 18. It's just a little or a little over 50% of the total score. On the other hand, this is an example of your data-driven pattern. And this time, what statistical analysis, the statistical analysis that was used was what we call cluster analysis. Remember, you have your factor analysis, your cluster analysis to do this, but this particular study did the cluster analysis. And this was to talk about the data-driven dietary patterns in a cross-sectional sample of Singaporean children 6 to 12 years of age. Now, when they did their analysis, statistical methods, they came up with 3 different clusters. Cluster 1 is the Western type of dietary pattern, which was the most prevalent cluster, consisting of 42%. And cluster 2 is the convenience type of diet pattern. And the last cluster is what they call the local or the hawker dietary pattern, which was the least prevalent cluster. So in short, with cluster analysis or factor analysis, you will now see the different predominant dietary pattern from the data that were gathered in their analysis. Now, the dietary pattern can have 2 different directions, no? Whether they can have high quality or low quality. Of course, with the high quality dietary pattern, it will result to a better outcome. And the reverse is true, no? If the dietary pattern is of low quality, of course, it will result to poorer outcome. So these dietary patterns are expected, no, to reduce outcome risk, no? Like for example, the DASH diet and the healthy Mediterranean diet. So here, the quality is high, so we will expect a better outcome. So the higher the score from the DASH diet score or the healthy Mediterranean diet score, the better is the outcome. On the other hand, there are some dietary patterns that are of low quality. An example of this utilized the NOVA food classification system, which is being used in Brazil. Now, with this classification, it assigns a group to food products based on how much processing they have undergone. Let's say, for example, from unprocessed or minimally processed to ultra-processed foods and drinks. So with ultra-processing, naturally, this will connote a lower quality of the dietary pattern. So here, if you score high on the NOVA food classification system, meaning to say if the food is heavily ultra-processed, so the higher the score, the poorer is the outcome. Now let's go to dietary patterns and health outcomes. This has been investigated among adults. No? First, from index-based dietary patterns studies, and next from data-driven dietary pattern studies. So let's start with the results from the index-based dietary pattern study. In this updated systematic review and meta-analysis that was published in 2020, consisting of 113 reports and close to 3.3 million adult participants older than 18 years of age, whose credibility of evidence was considered moderate, it was shown that those adults having higher scores on Healthy Eating Index, Alternate Healthy Eating Index, and DASH score have lower risks of all-cause mortality, cardiovascular diseases incidence or mortality, cancer incidence or mortality, type 2 diabetes, and neurodegenerative diseases. With regards to the data from data-driven dietary pattern studies, this one was an umbrella review of all meta-analysis of prospective cohort studies that was also published in 2020, which included 116 cohorts and close to 4.8 million subjects. In this particular study, a healthy dietary pattern was shown to reduce the risk for these particular diseases, which were considered either of moderate or very low quality of evidence. Those with low to moderate level of evidence are the following, like type 2 diabetes, cancer, some cancers, all-cause mortality, cardiovascular disease mortality, certain pulmonary diseases, and colorectal cancers. On the other hand, unhealthy dietary patterns was shown to increase the risk for these particular diseases, like type 2 diabetes again, metabolic syndrome, even bone fractures, all-cause mortality, and some form of colorectal carcinoma. And they tried to use this different term. Healthy was connoted a healthy type of diet, prudent, or fruits and vegetables, whereas unhealthy type of pattern are considered unhealthy, quote-unquote, Western or high-fat, traditional, or sweets and fats. So again, these are the foods associated with healthy and unhealthy. Healthy foods being predominantly plant-based with olive oil and seeds, beans, vegetables, fruits, and nuts. And unhealthy are more of the processed foods and sugar-sweetened foods and beverages. Now, those are the studies in adults. There are also studies in dietary patterns and health outcomes in children. But studies among children pose certain inherent difficulties, difficulties in prescribing a certain dietary pattern because of the following factors. When you are dealing with children, you should take into consideration also that they are transitioning also from child to adult diet, to adult diet. And of course, you should also account for their rapid growth rate and higher energy and nutrient requirements. So sometimes even in a particular age group, they may also have different growth rates. And you also have to remember that they have limited capacity for food intake, especially in the first year of life. So rapid growth rate, high energy requirement, but limited food capacity. Of course, you have also to note that early childhood is critical in the development of healthy eating habits. So we're not just talking about the quantity of food, but also the quality, as well as the habits in terms of eating that transcend into adulthood and may impact also on later health. Also, in children, particularly in early childhood, milk plays a significant source of nutrition. So this has to be factored in the recommendation. And more importantly, in older children and adolescents, perhaps compliance may pose a problem, particularly if you are going to prescribe, let's say, a Mediterranean diet on an adolescent or a DASH diet in an adolescent. Now, this slide shows you the different, the studies on dietary patterns and health outcomes and the problems that are encountered in them. First of all, there are very few available studies on dietary patterns and health outcomes in children compared to adults. Mostly, these studies are descriptive in nature, observational, and lacks experimental design. And of course, it has also been pointed out that large variety of indices were used utilizing different quality of the dietary assessment tools which have not been validated. So the question here is the validation of the dietary assessment tools. And they also have noted that the approach is different if you are coming from developed or developing countries. Because in developed countries, most studies were done to know the association with diet quality and just a few on diet-related or chronic diseases. On the other hand, the focus is different in developing countries. The focus in developing countries are mainly for assessment of nutrient adequacy and growth. So, due to limited time, I just summarized the studies that I have encountered in my search on dietary patterns and health outcomes in children. I just like to summarize this in this slide that shows that unhealthy dietary pattern is related to the following health outcomes in children. With regards to weight problems, so unhealthy dietary pattern increases the risk for overweight, and that it also results to higher fat mass and body mass index in late adolescence. So the implication of this is that it may predispose to overweight and obesity in later adolescence. Also, in terms of cardiovascular parameters, it has been shown and studied that unhealthy dietary pattern was related to higher cardiometabolic markers that were independent of the body mass index. And what are these markers? Systolic blood pressure, test for insulin resistance, and certain biochemical parameters such as triglycerides. What about neurocognitive development? There are studies that shows that unhealthy dietary pattern was related to increased odds or risk of getting attention deficit hyperactivity or ADHD among children. In some studies, particularly in Asia, like Korea, they have shown that unhealthy dietary pattern was related to poor social skills and problematic behavior. There are also studies regarding respiratory illnesses, particularly the increased risk for asthma in those children who are on unhealthy dietary pattern. Now, the features of the studies on dietary patterns in children, actually, I have noted down two of these features. First is tracking. When we say tracking, I only meant that when there is early dietary exposure, it may predispose or it may be a prelude to later dietary patterns. So that's one in terms of tracking. Just an example, in Brazil, children who did not receive exclusive breastfeeding until 4 months were shown to have higher adherence to unhealthy and snack pattern. In Australia, there was positive association between breastfeeding during infancy and healthy meat and vegetable pattern at age 2 to 8 years of age. Tracking may also be in the form of having early dietary patterns that can be persistent to later childhood, or patterns that can track to later childhood. Two examples are stated here. One is the Childhood Obesity Project of the European Union, or the EU CHOP project, wherein they noted that dietary patterns that were acquired at 2 years of age and persisting till late childhood were associated with cardiometabolic markers at 8 years of age. And they have different types of dietary patterns. And the core dietary pattern, which was high in vegetables, fruits, fish, olive oil, etc., was inversely related with systolic blood pressure and insulin resistance. So meaning to say, those children who consume these core dietary patterns have lower levels of systolic blood pressure and lower incidence of insulin resistance. In another study in a birth cohort in northern Portugal, this time, adherence to dietary pattern rich in energy-dense foods, processed meat, or low in vegetables at 7 years of age was associated with increased cardiometabolic markers at 10 years of age. So here, what this slide just means is that if the child is having a pattern early in life that is healthy or unhealthy, it can have an impact sometimes later in childhood, whether for a better or a poorer outcome. Now, the other feature of studies on dietary patterns in children is the effect of socio-demographic factors. Now, these socio-demographic factors appear to correlate with diet quality in children and include these different factors, no? As stated here: age, gender, down the line, until marital status of parents. What is consistent in these studies in terms of socio-demographic factors were the following. Younger children and those coming from high-income bracket, no? High-income bracket, and girls have better scores, no, compared to, let's say, older children, lower socioeconomic status, and boys. Now, in another study on effects of socio-demographic factor, this is a more recent one compared to the other, and this time, this is a study done in Greece on early life determinants of dietary patterns in preschool children. So they identified 3 dietary patterns, namely Mediterranean, snacky pattern, and Western dietary pattern. So what they found out were the following. Now, preschool attendance and increased time spent with the mothers for at least 2 hours were positively associated with Mediterranean diet. However, watching television was inversely associated with Mediterranean diet. Lower parental education, maternal age, and earlier introduction of solids were associated with the snacky dietary pattern. And lastly, exposure to passive smoking and watching TV were associated with the Western diet. So let me just summarize, what I talked about in the last few minutes. First was that there was already a shift in focus from nutrients to dietary patterns because of certain advantages, because we do not eat food as nutrient, but rather as their whole component. 2, dietary patterns usually correlate with diet quality. And of course, in terms of clinical significance, dietary patterns are related to chronic health outcomes that are found in later life, particularly certain cardiovascular diseases and metabolic diseases. In terms of how to determine your dietary pattern, 2 approaches are being expounded. The index-based approach and the data-driven approach, which each has certain advantages and disadvantages. Now, when we talk about the relationship of dietary patterns with disease outcome, we have to remember that certain chronic diseases may be related to dietary patterns, but these are more evident in adults because more studies are being done in adults. In children, few studies are available on dietary patterns and disease outcomes, which are mainly centering on effects on weight. So at this time, for children's dietary pattern, further studies are needed to elucidate their relationship with each other. So with that, I would like to thank you all for listening.